Disclaimer. The views expressed in this video, as well as the content and images, are for review purposes only. If you are interested in what we are reviewing, please pick up a book and form your own opinions. What I like and dislike, others may not like or dislike. Reading is a very individual thing. If you do pick up the book, please leave a review, as this not only helps out authors financially, but is essential to helping us improve our skills. Furthermore, if you'd like to support me and my channel, you can follow the links down in the descriptions to my own works and my own books. And you can also help out by liking or commenting below and subscribing to the channel. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're reviewing Shadow of the Conqueror by Shad Brooks. And before I begin on the timeline and recap and likes and dislikes, I want to offer a sort of secondary disclaimer. I am subscribed to the Shadiversity channel. I actually really like watching his videos. He's a very knowledgeable fellow. He does good content, and in a lot of his views I support him, though we do have certain disagreements. And I say all of this to preface the fact that I'm probably going to be fairly mean to this book. So let's begin. Dalen, or Dalus the Conqueror, is sitting in his old shack lamenting his life. He is 82 years old, and he is convinced he has led a very sinful life, let's say. He's murdered millions of people and raped hundreds of women, and he's in the middle of writing a letter confessing who he is and detailing his life and all the various crimes he believes he's committed. It wouldn't be complete without him adding a little bit of slander towards a group of individuals he claims enjoys relations with goats, which he has a nice little chuckle about because Dalen isn't a good person. He wanders around his hovel, looking at the various things that he's fixed and maintained for the local people. Dalen was trained to be an engineer in his childhood by his parents, and he is referred to locally as a tinker, which he hates because, despite his love for building and fixing things, he hates building and fixing things. He doesn't actually say this, but it's what comes across. He's waiting for his ride to the skyport in a nearby town by a local farmer. And as he goes outside to wait, his bones rickety and clattering against each other, he notices there's an individual known as a Lightbringer just hanging out beside his fence. Dalen, being the kind, charismatic individual he is, goes up to this guy and basically says, "What the hell are you doing on my property?" The Lightbringer, being kind, just tells him he's waiting on somebody and offers to give Dalen a bit of healing to help ease his rickety old bones. Dalen accepts and continues to berate the younger man until his ride shows up. In which case he turns his attention to the driver, who graciously agreed to take time out of his day in order to take this crotchety old man to where he needs to go. Dalen spends the remainder of the ride berating this man until they reach the city, where he presents him with a large bag of gold and tells him he has to keep it all. When they enter the city, his driver, who is also a farmer, ties a red ribbon around his arm. This is a signal to other people that he is open to being challenged for a duel. Dalen calls him an idiot and tells him not to ruin his life by wasting it on something so frivolous. And when the younger man basically says, "Hey, I've won a few duels and I'm not that bad," Dalen, this 82-year-old man, challenges him to a duel, which he proceeds to thoroughly thrash this farmer at, basically, I think, knocking one of his teeth out. After thoroughly embarrassing the younger man, he explains that, "Oh yes, I fought in the last night, and blah blah blah, you shouldn't waste your life on this. Young people are so impetuous. I can't believe they're so hot-headed." I'm telling you all this because it's foreshadowing for later. After some exposition as we travel through the town, and Dalen is explaining everything that comes to his eye and how much he knows, just expounding it to this young naive farmer, they eventually reach the docks. Dalen asks the young man to please acquire him a ship so that he can find a way to the edge. That's where he wants to go. The farmer is a little bit concerned, though the book tells us that the farmer doesn't like Dalen. He's like, "Are you sure you got a ride back?" The younger man seems to be quite concerned about this older gentleman. And I say gentleman as in lack for another term. A bastard would be more appropriate, but this is YouTube, so we'll try to keep the language to a minimum. The young man arranges for Dalen to get on a skyship to a city that's close to the edge, where Dalen intends to commit suicide. How does he intend to do this? Well, in this universe, there are two magical substances. One is known as Darkstone, which basically locks in place until light is shown upon it, and Sunstone, which is self-explanatory. It's lighted stone. It shines light. These two interact in various ways, and due to the structure of the universe, or their universe, they live on a flat parcel of land that's surrounded by a barrier that if you pass through, you just emerge on the other side. But if you pass through using either Sunstone or Darkstone, you die. Well, normal one way of poisoning isn't enough for Dalus, the Conqueror. He decides he's going to take both, because he's obviously much more important. He's going to go out on his terms, and he's going to jump off the side of the world holding both at the same time. Which he does. And he knows it's going to take hours. So he's just trying his best to stay conscious as he's pushed around by the wind and cold. He's 82 years old and he's constantly complaining about the pain in his body. And why did I take this route? I'm going to go out. I need to stay conscious on my own terms. Until he hits the barrier. And once he passes through the barrier, to his shock, he doesn't die. Would have been a much shorter book otherwise. He's also shocked to find that he's now young and apparently has powers. Lightbinder powers, to be exact. In this world, there is a couple forms of magic, and one of these magicians is called a Lightbinder, who can draw light within themselves and bind it to various body parts. I'm going to remind you of that because at some point I believe the author forgot. Dalen decides to test his powers by increasing and decreasing his mass and trying to get back to land because he wants to land safely, completely ignoring the fact that the entire point of jumping off the absolute highest thing he could was an attempt to off himself. But he's like, no, I'm not going to go out like that. Since I didn't get to go out the way that I wanted, I'm going to land, and I'm going to continue to suffer because this is what the light wanted. Did I also mention that they view the light as a kind of god? Well, through tricks of increasing and decreasing his mass, he is able to land safely. Through some questionable physics we might cover later. Turns out that he's landed clear on the other side of the world, because that's how passing through one side and emerging on the other works. After some long-winded power testing, he runs across a small farm in the middle of nowhere, which is run by a family which subscribes to the religion matronology, in which the female is in charge of the family. How in charge and the very specifics of it, we aren't going to get into too much detail. There's more detail in the book, but it's kind of long-winded, and it's not something I want to cover here. The farmer agrees to put Dalen up for the night, and Dalen, who had at this point decided, well, now that I'm young, I need to go forge a birth certificate, because after a life of crime that you're repentant for, the very first thing you want to do is go commit another crime. He makes the very obvious and clear decision to not give this person a fake name and to give him his original name of Dalen, because guile is not a skill that Dalen possesses. After a meal in which the girls of the family are fawning over how cute Dalen is, and the boy is so envious of how free Dalen is, and Dalen is just kind of abusive to everybody in the room, the kind farmer offers Dalen a sword because no man should be traveling without a sword. This is a very martial society. There is a reason they all have lots and lots of weapons, though at some points that brings up more questions than answers. As Dalen is leaving, the young man comes up to Dalen deciding he wants to travel with him. When Dalen flat out refuses, the young man challenges him to a duel. To which Dalen, who just moments ago, or hours ago by his time, had been lecturing another man about not being so quick to duel and not so quick to anger, thoroughly beats the crap out of this younger man, and then tells him, get back in that house and honor your parents and do what they tell you and blah 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 blah. You know, completely forgetting all the things that he had previously told another young man. Then we get a bit more power testing. There's quite a bit of power testing in this book. If you're bored of it now, you're going to be bored of it later. And a lot of this is basically how fast can I run? I have 4 bonds that I can link to different parts of my body. How fast can I run? How high can I jump? How light can I make myself? How heavy can I make myself? Blah, 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 blah. He tires himself out and makes it to a city, where in true military genius fashion, somebody who's lived to 82 years old and gained the wisdom that only decades of time and suffering can bring, decides it's a good idea to fall asleep in an alley, and is surprised to wake up to a hobo about to murder him. Well, Dalen's not about to have any of this. After a very quick torture session in which he vivisects the individual, following up by decapitating him and pinning his head to the wall with his own knife, breaks down in tears at just how evil and horrible of a person he is for doing this. This is starting to feel a bit disingenuous. I'd say that stopped being self-defense somewhere around the vivisection, but that's just my opinion. Dalen then decides to test his powers around town by testing his hearing and testing his sight and climbing up on roofs, where he promptly falls off into a crowded shopping district and uses his power to stop himself from splattering on the pavement. Again, I'm not sure why. He's been whinging about dying this whole time, and that seems like it would have been a less effective way than the previous fall he stopped himself from, but Dalen is nothing if not inconsistent. And he lands right in front of a shopkeeper, who is amazed. In fact, everybody in the entire district is amazed, and Dalen only gets off by telling him he's a member of the Arknights out on a survey reconnaissance or some other such nonsense. He knows it's a weak lie. He knows he'll probably get caught, but as I've said before, Dalen has no guile. Eventually, he makes it to his old home, and the Lightbringer's still there. And would you know it, Dalen is the person the Lightbringer was waiting for. Dalen tells him, the oh-so-convenient cover, that he is the son of the previous Dalen that lived there, despite the fact that he looks like the most infamous conqueror and mass murderer and rapist in history. The Lightbringer, who's supposed to be the paragon of all good and honesty, just takes this at face value and follows Dalen into his house, where the farmer who gave Dalen a ride is now sitting in there reading the note. Well, Dalen had been hoping to snag this before anybody could read it because he wanted to get all of his crap out of this building. Well, now the cat's out of the bag, and the farmer now knows that the old man who lived there was Dalus the Conqueror, which means that since the Lightbringer has decided to follow Dalen everywhere because he was the person he was looking for, the Lightbringer knows that the old man who lived there was Dalus the Conqueror. Convenient that. Well, Dalen makes up a convenient excuse about who his mother was in the village and how he was fathered on this widow who conveniently is dead, and then proceeds to go through the house finding all of his old stuff. The Lightbringer, we're going to call him Elric because I believe that's how his name was pronounced, starts questioning some of the things that Dalen is doing until he brings out Imperius, Dalus the Conqueror's old sword. Now, this is kind of a iffy thing. So, Imperius is supposed to be linked to Dalus the Conqueror in such a way that if Imperius is destroyed, it would almost assuredly kill Dalus. And if Dalus died, the blade itself was supposed to break. There is a rare circumstance where the link can be passed on to the firstborn child, which Dalen says is the convenient excuse as to why it passed to him, because apparently he was the firstborn child who is the youngest of all the children of a notorious rapist. Yes, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, the Lightbringer doesn't really hem and haw about it, actually. He just accepts it on face value. And then Dalen pulls out another object, which is very, very similar and is supposed to be linked to Dalus the Conqueror. And oh look, that one mysteriously passed on to him as well. And then he starts putting on his old clothes. Dalen, as I have said before, is possessed of absolutely zero guile, and he thinks the best way to hide is to look exactly how he used to look, and apparently act exactly as he used to act. Because after putting on his old dueling clothes and attaching his old medal, which states that he's an Imperial High Master, or a Grand High Master, I can't remember which right off the top of my head, the highest class of swordsman, which obviously a 17-year-old is not, the Lightbringer challenges him to a duel to prove it, which they duel. And Dalus promptly gets the upper hand. And the Lightbringer just surrenders, because the duel was just to test if he was actually that good. The Lightbringer is now so enamored with Dalen that he's willing to back him up and tells him to make a new braid of beads to show just how powerful he is so that people are less likely to challenge him. The fact that he's going around dressed as this universe's version of Hitler mixed with Genghis Khan not being enough for people to want to challenge him. One of the local people, who Dalen used to have a problem with, because Dalen has a problem with everybody he meets, so I really shouldn't have made the distinction, takes umbrage with the fact that Dalen's walking around with all this paraphernalia and challenges him to a duel. Well, I say challenges him to a duel, I really mean he was mildly rude at this incredulous young child, and for his trouble basically got all of his ribs broken. The Lightbringer then decides to pull Dalen away using his own powers, to which Dalen is entirely incredulous. Why would this man use his powers against me to stop me from using my powers against random bystanders who don't have powers? Doesn't he understand how good I am? Yes, wildly inconsistent. The Lightbringer tells him, and I'm just going to call him the Lightbringer because I'm not going to try his name anymore, that he needs to be more careful. He could have killed that man, and if the Lightbringer himself hadn't been there, he absolutely would have. And there's a short lecture about Dalen trying to be not as violent towards other people. It doesn't really seem to be sinking in, but it's important that he be lectured, and then the Lightbringer's all hunky-dory, okay, let's keep going, and immediately uses his Lightbringer powers to make gold to pay for their cab fare, because counterfeiting is certainly not going to help. I mean, Dalen's already at the point of recidivism. He's going to reoffend again, you can already tell. And hey, let's just make up some money to get our cab fare. And it's during this ride that the Lightbringer decides to teach Dalen about sensing light powers, because Dalen was already abusing the powers he has, why not teach him a few more? Because funny. Next we meet up with Lyra and Cusack, who are two actual Arknights, who are now on the pursuit of this mysterious young man who has powers that only they are supposed to have. Apparently he caused quite a bit of a scene with his lies and flagrant murder, and so there have been people sent to investigate. Here we meet Lyra, who is a female Arknight who was one of Daelus's old victims, who apparently has enough PTSD to break down whenever somebody mentions sex, but not enough to not turn around and immediately make fun of somebody after one of her breakdowns. And Cusack, who is a foreigner from a land where they are naked for reasons of making other people strong, that the greatest weakness a person can show is the physical reaction of attraction to another person when they are naked around them. He's from a fairly austere society. And I have to say Cusack is probably the best character, because he is very honest about who he is, he's very proud of his own culture, and he is constantly looking for something to snack on. I like Cusack a lot, despite the fact that Lyra makes fun of Cusack all the time. But here's a problem interaction. Cusack will constantly ask Lyra when she does something he finds odd if it's about the sex, to which Lyra replies very violently and then proceeds to tease Cusack. This is the bulk of their interactions, and I'm not going to cover it anymore. Cut back to Dalen and the Lightbringer, and they have finally made it to a town. And we have some more power testing, because for some reason, after immediately deciding to follow this young man, they break apart again, and Dalen decides to test out his ears to look for trouble. He immediately hears the sound of somebody being raped. Then, in true superhero fashion, decides to cause an immense amount of property damage, breaking into the wall of the house like the Kool-Aid Man, grabbing the rapist's member, looking him in the eye, and then ripping it straight from his body. Then decapitating him for good measure, because the act of ripping off that particular part is generally fatal, but we don't want to take any chances. The girl, who just moments ago was being traumatized, looks up pleadingly at Dalen, who tells her, "I have just saved you," and she looks at him and says, "But that was my father." I paused there for a moment for you all to shudder for the moral implications of what was going on, something which Dalen does not allow to be addressed. He basically tells her, "Tell your mom the truth, just be happy I saved you," and then proceeds to leave and dispense his own form of property damage-inducing vigilante justice. There's actually a big argument shortly after this between Dalen and the Lightbringer about the morality and legality of what he did, and apparently there are laws, conveniently enough, to protect Dalen breaking into people's houses and dismembering them, even if he was stopping them from doing something wrong. Now, hey, I get the desire to stop people from doing something wrong, and I'm not saying we need to protect these people, but when you're literally ripping people's houses open and dismembering them because of what you heard from a distance, we're getting into some dubious territory, let's say. He also spends his time killing a few other criminals before that particular argument, doing a fantastic job of laying low, looking exactly like who he used to be, going around killing people and acting smug. So Dalen decides that now's the time that they need to leave the city and find a ride. Now, they could have rode on any old ship, but Dalen decides, hey, let's get on a smuggler's ship, because I want to kill some folks and I want to make sure they're bad folks. And surprise, surprise, the smuggler's ship they pick is full of pirates. Oh, Dalen sure can pick 'em. Well, they're not just any pirates, as a matter of fact. Their captain is one of Dalen's bastards, the notorious Captain Blackheart, who Dalen immediately proceeds to kill by means of impalement. Because that's some fantastic father-son bonding. Now, he doesn't just impale his ne'er-do-well son. He makes sure he knows exactly who he's being impaled by. The Lightbringer is notably horrified at what Dalen has done and proceeds to berate him, but Dalen's like, oh no, I'm sure they've done something horrible to warrant the absolute merciless massacre that I have been imparting upon them. Let's check their cargo hold. And sure enough, it's full of captured young women on their ways to be sex slaves. And the Lightbringer is again horrified, and Dalen is now apparently justified in stalking the rest of the ship and murdering the rest of the crew. Well, all except for one he decides to spare because he's got a nice bright light inside. That's something we'll cover a bit more later. This young man immediately becomes Dalen's new beating slave, who is just someone there for Dalen to beat on for disagreeing with him. Dalen spends some time in his son's cabin when he is approached by one of the girls he saved, who makes an advance on him, and he immediately shuts her down, thinking about all the women he's wronged in his past. There's a whole thing there about women who've been used once in this society who aren't married are considered sullied, considering the vast majority of crimes in this country are sexual in nature. It leads me to some questions. Anyway, they make it to their next port, and Dalen immediately gives the ship and a ton of gold to the slave. His beating slave, as a matter of fact, and sets him free. And this is where Lyra and Cusack catch up. And this is where I'm going to leave off my recap. This will bring you to about the 30% mark of the book. And now we're going to get into my likes, dislikes, and my thoughts. I'm going to be pretty hard on this book, but I want to focus a bit on some of the good things because I believe there was a good story. Here, it just wasn't executed well. There were the bones of one, at least. So first of all, this world has a lot of potential. The author introduced two very simple elements that both have incredible potential when used together in a variety of different ways. The magic system also has a lot of promise because it has almost a physics feel. And the world is very big with lots of different people and lots of different cultures that you do get to experience a bit. Also, I always like any series that has a very well-armed populace, and every single person carries a weapon of some kind, and there is meaning behind all the weapons. Basically there to help them face off against the night, which this is a world where it's perpetual day, and when night falls there are creatures called the Shade which come out and are basically monsters. The only way to kill them is with things that allow them to bleed out, and so slashing weapons are the preferred. So weapons like the rapier, which are purely meant for dueling, in a society that has a strong dueling culture, are considered arrogant. Hey, this makes sense to me. The weapons serve a practical purpose. I really like that the type of weapon a person carries says a lot about the type of person that person is. And a lot of thought went into some of these different areas, and you can tell just by the dump truck loads of exposition. Dalen has an interesting backstory that's pretty much relived through some of the mini prologues at the start of some of the chapters. In fact, I think it would have probably made a more interesting story than what we got. It tells a story of a man who basically was forced to fight in a war, then forced to fight in a second war due to the corruption of the aristocracy, where he had to make some very hard choices, which led to him becoming the monstrous tyrant that he was. It went from necessity to corruption. It's a wonderful little story. I think that's probably the story we should have been given. Also, this is the only character that's going to make it into my likes, because I liked Cusack as a character. His culture is interesting. They have this thing about being strong, where one can control their face and their desires. So they make themselves as attractive as possible, and then they basically walk around naked, because restraint is a very enviable trait in their culture, let's say. Somebody who is strong is a great person, and someone who is weak is often branded. And the weakest one can be is to give in to their lust, which unfortunately Cusack did, and he bears the brand for it. So in order to be redeemed somewhat in his society's eyes, he went to become an archknight, which about a third of the people who do die. And while some of the other characters criticize this, I can understand why he would do this, and I could even say it was a good thing that he did it. He found he was weak in one area, so he pursued a different area where he was strong. And he's a little bit insensitive, but he kind of has to be by how his culture is set up. And finally, I liked the peace versus security argument that comes with Daelus's rule. Daelus basically instituted a communist state where everything was owned by the state. However, he did it better than most communists as all his people were fed. They weren't fed a lot, and there was a lot of resentment there, but they were at least fed. He saved up the rest of the food for the next time the night would fall, and to provide for his armies, which were basically attempting to conquer the world and damn near succeeded. But with sunshine must come nighttime. Let's get into the dislikes. First of all, and not least of all, there is too much exposition in this book. Constant technical details about everything we see. The skyports, what people are wearing, the type of swords people are using, down to the type of hilts that they have, their age, what they're made of, where they come from, the processes by which they are made, how the planes stay in the sky, the floating islands, the number of swords people carry, how ships work. We spend a whole 10-minute section in the audiobook just going over how he's trying to jerry-rig this ship, how the sun forging works. There's even a section where we cover some math problems. There is too much explaining in this book, and it just goes on and on and on. Now, I've read books with a lot of exposition. I've probably put a bit too much exposition into my own works. But this book is probably a solid 40% exposition on how things work, and it's a bit too much for the type of character Dalen is. And it is Dalen who's explaining most of this stuff, and you can have a lot of exposition in dialogue, which is most of the dialogue in this. But that's not all the dialogue, and that's going to make the second point about what I didn't like. The interactions between a lot of these characters is painful. It goes on for a bit too long. I'm not sure if it's meant to be funny most of the time. And the reactions don't feel organic. And I really don't want to go into the interactions because they are so long. We will have 5 to 10 to 15-minute sections where characters are just talking. And they're taking the piss out of each other, or they're mocking each other, or they're being angry at each other, or they're explaining things about their culture. It doesn't feel like how most people talk, and I get that a lot of information is exchanged by dialogue, and not just in books, but by people. That's why schools exist. But in a novel like this, where you want to keep some fast pace, you want it to be a bit snappier. A quick explanation. That's all you need. And some of the arguments are just far too pointless for far too long. They argue about humor. They argue about justice. They argue about law. They argue about culture. They argue and argue and argue and argue, and it just feels like nothing's happening. But with that said, let's talk a little bit about the characters. First of all, I'm going to gripe a bit about Lyra. So Lyra is a middle-aged woman who's an Arcanine. She's a darn powerful one by all the standards in the book. But the thing is, let's just say she can dish it out, but she can't take it. Now, I'm not going to be a person who's going to laugh at somebody's past trauma, especially the trauma that Lyra has. She was basically one of Dalen's concubines. Someone he played around with for a month and then tossed back out into the world. It is established Dalen's not a good guy, and this was not a good fate for a girl who was 14 years old. It's a very tragic past, but she's 40 at this point, and she's quick to mock everybody else. But the moment somebody touches on something she's uncomfortable with, she explodes. And the whole time I'm thinking, why are you harassing these other people when you are as fragile as a china cup? She's also insufferably bossy. Now, I can understand there are some girl boss characters that can be fun, but Lyra's not that kind. She breaks down at the mention of sex, but is quick to fight other people, at least until the sex thing comes up, which makes her remarkably easy to beat. This all brings up the question, why did she decide to be one of the primary law enforcement units of a country whose primary offenses all seem to be sex-related? It seems like a really, really bad choice. Next, let's talk about Elric the Lightbringer, who follows Dalen around. First of all, he's stupid. He's got to be about the dumbest man I have ever read about. He can't even see who Dalen is despite Dalen's complete lack of discretion and guile. The guy's literally parading around in his old clothes with a sword that only he can use and a gauntlet that only he can use, talking about things that only he would know, with experience that he should not have at the age that he appears to be, in a world of magic where it's revealed that people can be brought back to life, so it's not a far stretch that someone could be made young again, and Elric takes way too long to make this connection. They're traveling around for, I think, a few weeks before he makes this connection. During this time, when they're traveling around, he basically just forgives Dalen for everything he does wrong. He might chastise him for a second, but it doesn't last. It doesn't linger. He's not actually hard on the boy. He doesn't see the threat the boy poses, despite the fact that he's literally breaking into people's houses and murdering them. He's also got a fairly trite sense of humor, which could have been fun. There are some parts he actually made me laugh because of the corniness of his jokes. But with how long this book is and how thick it is in exposition, it does not work. Elric could have been a fun character. Had we had a bit more of his perspective, we really could have seen that, like, hey, maybe he's suspicious, but he's trying not to make Dalen suspicious that he thinks anything. But no, he just seems to follow along blindly for whatever reason. It's like, the light told me to follow you, son, so I'm going to follow you. You really need to stop murdering people. Maybe today we'll start with only murdering one person and keep it at that. No, Elric is probably about one of the dumbest people, and I mean that on a wisdom level. He just can't see things right in front of his face, and this is one of the men who led the rebellion against Dallas. He was a military general. He should not be this dumb. But since we're speaking of dumb, let's get into Dalen. This is probably going to be the longest part of the dislike. First of all, Dalen is far too smug. He calls everyone around him stuff like little snot, little kid, basically deriding them for their age, when he himself looks like a 17-year-old. He's condescending to every person he meets, and his very first response to any kind of opposition is snark, and the immediate second response is violence. Throughout the book, he claims that he wants to die. Oh, how he wants to die. He begs for it. He pleads for it. And if there was any justice in the world, a comet would fall from the sky and take him out and end this book. But he actively looks for reasons not to die. He actively does things to prevent himself from dying. When he first jumped off of the world and went through the barrier, which put him back on the top of the world, he could have allowed himself to simply fall to his death. He was made young by doing something that no one else had done, taking a light stone and a dark stone and jumping off the edge, thinking that taking both would have killed him, but somehow taking both gave him superpowers and made him young again. For somebody who was trained as an engineer, he should have been like, oh, this is a new reaction. Well, I can still carry on with what I was doing. I intended to fall to my death anyway. Hitting the ground at terminal velocity will achieve the same effect. In fact, now that he has powers, he could hit the ground even harder. But no, he uses these new powers to save himself because he wasn't serious about it in the first place. In fact, if he was serious about it, he could have told anybody at any time who he was and let them take him out. Heck, he could have done that and attacked a city of bad people, because apparently there are entire pirate cities, and basically ended it that way. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't actively look for ways to end himself. He's actively looking for ways to not do so and making excuses for it. And now that he has powers, let's talk a little bit about his power curve, because he is way too powerful. He'll learn completely new overpowered things just from conversation, observation, or a study of physics. He can see miles away. He can run almost 100 miles an hour. He can jump so hard he can clear mountains. He can increase and decrease his density for whatever reason. His powers come up too easily, and the way they're supposed to work is he's supposed to be able to apply the bonds to a body part. But instead he applies them to things like his speed and his fortitude and his healing. These are not body parts. This is supposed to be hard fantasy where his power has an actual structure to it, but almost as soon as he gets it, he's breaking it. Density is not a body part. Granted, I feel he might have wrote himself into a corner with that. He could have phrased it better as in apply it to an aspect of himself, which would have cleared out most of that, but with the sheer amount of technical explanation in the rest of the book, this really should have been thought about a little bit better. And these powers come way too easy for him. A good chunk of the exposition is just Dalen power testing, seeing what he can do, seeing what he can change, seeing how he can make his powers stronger, faster, better, stronger, how he can apply them in different ways and what the reactions are. And it's just simply too broken. He's like a Skyrim character with cheat codes. At some point it just becomes boring because there's actually no threat to him and there's no point to his existence. And I want to get into my biggest gripe about Dalen, and I've said it several times. He has no guile. He has no wisdom. Supposedly this is a man who waged 2 successful wars. You cannot do that without being deceptive, because the first rule of warfare is deception. Furthermore, he's over 80 years old. He's been living in hiding and lying to people for years. Did he not develop any guile in that time? He's walking around in his own clothes, going by his own name, trusting on a very flimsy pretext to make people not think he is who he is in a world full of magic where becoming young is not unheard of, at least not inconceivable. And he's also wearing his medallion from when he was the old man that said he was a Grand High Master of the Sword, which is the pinnacle of what a person can achieve and is probably not possible for a 17-year-old to achieve, along with all the other technical knowledge and wisdom and blah, 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 like all the stuff that Dalen knows how to do and knows about in historical events. He's not even trying to hide who he is, especially for someone who's also supposed to be a great deceiver. People talk about how he talks to people and makes them do what he wants, but I'm not seeing any of that in this character, whose first response is snark, and again, second response is unending violence. It's like he has no real concept of deceit. He's also revealing things that only his father, the person he claims he's not, should know, like who his old concubines were, and the different Grand Masters, and different areas that he is far too young to have traveled to. And he can't keep his mouth shut. Half of his problems could be solved if he could just shut the hell up. But he doesn't. He prattles on endlessly about things he has no reason to know about, especially for someone who's supposed to be pretending to be 17 years old. So when he regains his youth, he decides he wants to use his youth to become a better person through atonement. And he has all this technical and engineering knowledge, and his first thought could have been, hey, let's go rebuild some of the world and restructure things. I have a new lease on life. I could do so much good with my technical knowledge. But no, his first thought is, hey, let's go kill some people, preferably bad people, but I'm not the most choosy because of how the light works, and I'm going to get in that in a second. But he treats everybody around him like they're dumb children, when he looks younger than everybody else. And before I prattle more on about that, let's talk about the light. Because the light is an omnipresent thing. It's kind of like a god, a creation thing, source of all power. And it lingers in people, and Dalen is taught how to sense this by the Lightbringer. And the more light a person has in them is supposed to be kind of a measure of goodness, but not really. What it really measures is how right a person thinks they are. And it is mentioned that a sociopath would have probably about as bright a light as it would be possible to have, because they always think they're doing the right thing, even if they're doing terrible things. In fact, the only real way to make your light dimmer is if you perceive what you're doing as wrong and do it anyway. Meaning you could be doing perfectly the right things, but if you feel like you're wrong, then you're going to lose light. But if you're doing absolutely terrible things, but you feel like you're doing the right thing, perfectly fine, perfectly excusable, light won't leave you. Which leads me to believe that Dalen might actually be a sociopath, and it would fit tremendously with what he does. Dalen has no problem breaking the law. He has no problem killing people. In fact, he can justify virtually everything he does because he once made the law. It's not going to be long before Dalen reoffends, or basically tries to reconquer things, because all it's going to take is the wrong people in power for Dalen to be like, no, I think they're too wrong, and just conquers them anyway. And now with his powers and how broken he is, there's literally nobody who can stop him. And that's going to bring us to some logical inconsistencies. First of all, Dalen's sword. There's a part when we first see it where the Lightbringer says, "Oh, some people would want to steal that." And then immediately after, they list a whole bunch of reasons why that would be about the dumbest thing anybody could do. First of all, it's linked to an individual. If the sword breaks, the person most likely dies. If the person dies, the sword most likely breaks. Also, the person can call it from a distance to themselves, and next they always know where it is, at least in the direction it is, making it thereby impossible and virtually worthless to steal because there's no way to stop this. Next, the Sunicles break these sun-forged items, which is what a Sunicle is. It makes a item that's super strong but linked to an individual with stupid powerful properties, but they break when they're touched with Darkstone, which is remarkably common. And it stated this is supposed to be a secret, but almost all of their technology works with a combination of Sunstone and Darkstone. I feel like somebody would have figured this out pretty quick, especially since there's been 2 wars fought. Dalen himself has a gauntlet with a Darkstone blade, which is designed to break Sunicles, which would probably be part of history since he's the most notorious conqueror and rapist in history. But for some reason this is supposed to be a secret. But it's not. But it is. And people make armor out of this. People sunforge armor, knowing that if it breaks, and there's this very easily available substance that will break it, they'll most likely die. Insanity, logical inconsistency. And also, there's no way to keep this a secret after the last night because the Shade, the beings they are fighting, use this against people. This would have been seen, this would have been noticed, and people would have talked about it. It would be common knowledge at this point. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the powers, because a lot of the powers Dalen's supposed to figure out because he has a background in engineering. But the problem is, engineering isn't biology, and a lot of this is treated like biology. The powers are based on bonds to physical body parts. But I want to say right now, fortitude is not a body part, speed is not a body part, skill with swords is not a body part, mass is not a body part, and intelligence is not a body part. Legs, arms, head, eyes, ears, these are body parts, some of which Dalen will link his power to, but it's just logically inconsistent. And this is supposed to be a hard magic system, but it's really just a hard-to-believe magic system. Also, healing isn't a body part, and they use this to heal. Now, I can understand applying this power to a certain area to try to heal it. It needed to be explained better. Next, let's talk about some of the questionable physics, because I was trained as an engineer and this got on my nerves. So Dalen will suddenly increase his mass to stop himself in midair. I'm not sure how we came to this conclusion. It is entirely possible that you could lessen your inertia by drastically increasing your mass. But what tests do we have to prove this? If you run a massive object into an object with less mass, the object with the more mass will carry its inertia over. For a really rough explanation. One of the things about physics is conservation of energy and conservation of mass, neither of which seem to apply to this. Things have to go somewhere. But I'm not going to rag on that too much. The book has too much in it, and I really don't want to rag on it too long. Finally, let's get into my thoughts. First of all, this needed to be a villain's story. This did not need to be a story about repentance. That could have been done, but this would have been so much better as a villain's story. The start of the story should have been Dalen plotting his own suicide because he's angry and bitter at the people who overthrew him when all he wanted to do was save the world. He did everything right and these people were wrong. But now he has to die, but he's going to die on his own terms. So he follows the same path of jumping off the side of the world with the Sunstone and the Darkstone, only to be young again and gain all of his powers. Now he has reason to test them. Now he's going to conquer them twice as hard. They think the iron fist they had before was bad. They haven't experienced a fisting yet. And yes, that joke fits in with this book. Next, he should have come up with a much better story, given himself a different name, and acted a bit naive when he comes upon the Lightbringer. Yes, I heard that was who my father was. Look at all this stuff. I wanted to come see him, but oh, woe is me, he's actually dead. Oh no, he was that terrible conqueror. Well, I was left all this stuff. I should see what he had. Maybe I can use some of it for the betterment of the world. And then proceed to explore the place under the cover of looking at all the new stuff he has. And then he could have had plausible plausible excuses for, well, this was apparently Dad's old sword. It's like, can it even be wielded? He gives some deniability to himself as to why this is linked to him, as in, I don't understand it, oh no, being deceptive, actually having guile, and then proceed to have this Lightbringer follow him where he begins to corrupt him. Look at the horrible state of the world, look at this, look at that, constantly showing him examples of how the world around him is bad, bringing him to degrees to Dalen's way of thinking. And he could do this with every character he meets because he's supposed to be this smooth-talking emperor, somebody who can corrupt people with just his words. This would have been phenomenal because he could have slowly brought people to degrees to his way of thinking, and him being a true sociopath thinking he did nothing wrong would have fit perfectly with him retaining all that light. And he could have used that as an excuse because his light shines brighter than anybody else's, and it's a mark of goodness that he's in the right, that he's on the right path, and all these other people are wrong. How can they allow this stuff to continue when it's so wrong? He could have guilted everybody who didn't believe in him, made them weaker, and made the people who believe in him stronger while furthering his cause. That way, when he was eventually discovered as to who he was, there was genuine conflict as to who to follow and whether people had been told the truth about who he was. This is how this story could have gone much, much better, as opposed to the arrogant, brash, guileless individual that we were introduced to. Furthermore, with Dalen, when he took over the country, he basically instituted a communist state where he took all the land from everyone and basically made it the property of the state so that nobody could own it. I'm confused as to how he did this when basically the entire population is armed. Now, it is revealed that there are guns in this world, but everybody also has swords and has been trained with swords, and that was the majority of what people used. It's really, really hard to oppress an armed populace. It's why over history there were so many laws regarding it, but somehow Dalen was able to just confiscate everybody's land while still leaving them armed, which was a dumb mistake anyway. Next, we got to talk a little bit about rarity, because I don't think it's used like it should be. First of all, things like sunicles, these are supposed to be rare and precious items, but everybody seems to have one. They show up everywhere. Everybody has one. The technology is supposed to be very difficult, but apparently it's not because people just use it. Furthermore, there's also the thing with the Grand High Master. Dalen is supposed to be a Grand High Master, which is supposed to be the highest level that any person can achieve with a sword. But the Lightbringer he meets is also a Grand High Master? It's just a little bit too convenient. There's too many people who are too powerful and have too many rare items. Too many odd events are supposed to happen. And the link with the passing of the sword, people are too quick in this world to believe something so rare just happens. And yet they do. Furthermore, half of this book probably could have been cut. We could have spared a lot of the technical details, just kind of lightly touched on them, if at all, or touched on them when they were needed. And the pointless arguments and interactions between some of the characters probably could have been cut, especially a lot of the conversations between Lyra and Cusack. I know we need to have some character development, but this was not the way to do it. In fact, the entire search for Dalen probably could have been cut. The best time to meet Lyra and Cusack probably would have been when they caught up to Dalen. Also, despite them being some of the more interesting parts of the book, the little prologues probably could have been cut from the beginning of some of these chapters. I know they're there to establish who Dalen was, but they proceed to do that through a lot of the exposition. It was kind of unnecessary and doesn't even actually feel related to who Dalen is as a character. The man we're hearing about in these prologues does not feel like the Dalen that we are seeing in the actual book. And honestly, another way to take this is to just tell past Dalen's story. How he lost his parents during that night, how he had to overthrow the aristocracy, and how he was brought to degrees to being this corrupt monster in his eventual downfall to go live in obscurity and resentment. That would have been a much more interesting story. A little bit trite, a little bit played out, but a lot more interesting than what we got. And with that being said, and my throat turning raw, I will wish you all good luck. Thank you for listening to my review. If you have any books that you would like to hear my take on, please leave them in the description. I do tend to favor indie authors over conventionally published, but I will read whatever I find interesting or whatever captures my fancy. If you would like to read, review, or criticize my own works, I will include a link in the description. Also, please keep the comments civil in the comments section. Also, if you enjoy what I do, please consider giving this video a like, sharing my work, or subscribing to my channel. Thank you.